There's something deeply unsettling about the way we talk about self-discipline in our modern world, isn't there? We speak of it as if it were a muscle to be flexed, a tool to be wielded, a weapon against our own nature. We celebrate those who wake at 5 in the morning, who deny themselves pleasure, who push through pain and exhaustion in pursuit of some distant goal. But what if Henry David Thoreau was sitting with us today, watching this obsession with willpower and self-control? What might he say about our relationship with discipline? And more importantly, what might he reveal about the deeper questions we're really asking when we wonder whether self-discipline is good or bad? Thoreau once wrote that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, and I wonder sometimes if our modern fixation on self-discipline isn't just another form of that same desperation, dressed up in the clothes of productivity and success. We've turned discipline into an industry, complete with apps that track our habits, books that promise to unlock our willpower, and social media accounts that showcase the perfectly disciplined life. But in all this noise about optimization and control, have we lost sight of something essential? Have we forgotten to ask not just how to be disciplined, but why we want to be disciplined in the first place? When Thoreau retreated to Walden Pond in 1845, he wasn't running away from discipline. He was running toward a different kind of discipline entirely. The discipline he practiced wasn't about forcing himself to do things he didn't want to do. It was about aligning his life so completely with his values that discipline became unnecessary, or rather, it became as natural as breathing. He wrote, "I went to the woods to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." This is a different kind of discipline entirely, isn't it? It's the discipline of attention, of intention, of living with such clarity about what matters that the question of willpower barely arises. Think about your own life for a moment. When do you need the most willpower? When do you find yourself grinding through tasks, forcing yourself to do things that feel alien to your nature? Often, it's when we're pursuing goals that aren't truly ours, when we're living according to someone else's definition of success, when we've lost touch with the deeper current of our own being. The need for excessive self-discipline can be a signal that we're swimming against the stream of our authentic self, that we've somehow gotten turned around and are heading in a direction that our soul doesn't actually want to go. But this doesn't mean that all discipline is misguided. Thoreau himself was incredibly disciplined, but his discipline had a different quality to it. He was disciplined about his morning walks, about his observations of nature, about his writing, about living simply. But these weren't acts of self-denial or self-punishment. They were acts of self-expression, ways of becoming more himself rather than less. His discipline was in service of freedom, not in opposition to it. He understood something that we seem to have forgotten in our culture of forced optimization, that true discipline emerges naturally when we're aligned with our deeper purpose. There's a beautiful paradox here that Thoreau understood intuitively. The more we try to control ourselves through willpower alone, the more we often find ourselves struggling against our own nature. But when we take the time to understand what we truly want, what we truly value, what brings us alive, then discipline becomes something entirely different. It becomes less about forcing ourselves to do things and more about removing the obstacles that prevent us from doing what we naturally want to do. Consider how different this is from the way discipline is usually taught. We're told to set goals, create systems, track our progress, and push through resistance. We're taught to see our desires, our laziness, our tendency toward comfort as enemies to be conquered. But what if these aspects of ourselves aren't enemies at all? What if they're signals trying to tell us something important about whether we're on the right path? Thoreau spent years observing the natural world, and one of the things he noticed was that nature doesn't force things. A tree doesn't use willpower to grow toward the sun. A river doesn't discipline itself to flow toward the sea. These things happen naturally, effortlessly, because they're aligned with deeper forces and patterns. The tree grows toward light, because that's its nature. The river flows downhill because that's what water does. And perhaps, Thoreau suggests, human beings can live with a similar kind of natural discipline when we're aligned with our own deeper nature. This doesn't mean that growth is always easy or that we never have to do difficult things. A tree pushing through soil towards sunlight is doing something difficult, but it's not fighting against its nature. It's expressing its nature fully. The difference is profound. When we're aligned with our deeper purpose, difficult things don't feel like self-denial. They feel like self-expression. The challenge becomes not about overcoming ourselves, but about becoming ourselves more fully. But how do we discover this natural discipline? How do we find that deeper current that Thoreau was talking about? This requires a different kind of attention than what our culture usually promotes. It requires what Thoreau called quiet desperations. Opposite, a kind of quiet attention, a willingness to sit with ourselves and listen to what's actually there rather than what we think should be there. Thoreau's time at Walden was, in many ways, an experiment in this kind of attention. He simplified his life radically, not because he was against comfort or pleasure, but because he wanted to see clearly what was essential and what was merely habit or social expectation. He wrote, "Our life is frittered away by detail. Simplify, simplify." This simplification wasn't an act of self-denial. It was an act of self-discovery. By removing the non-essential, he could see more clearly what remained, what was truly important to him. When we apply this principle to our modern struggles with discipline, something interesting happens. Instead of asking, how can I force myself to do this thing I think I should do, we start asking, what do I actually want to do with my life? What matters to me so deeply that doing it feels like an expression of who I am rather than a betrayal of who I am? These are very different questions, and they lead to very different answers. The truth is that many of our discipline problems aren't really discipline problems at all. They're clarity problems. We're trying to discipline ourselves toward goals that aren't actually our goals, trying to live lives that aren't actually our lives. We've internalized so many shoulds and supposed tos that we've lost touch with our own wants and desires and values. And then we wonder why it's so hard to maintain motivation, why we keep falling off track, why willpower feels like such a constant struggle. Thoreau understood that before we can live deliberately, we have to know what we're being deliberate about. Before we can exercise discipline, we have to be clear about what we're disciplining ourselves toward and why. This requires a kind of honest self-examination that our culture doesn't often encourage. It requires us to sit quietly with ourselves and ask difficult questions. What do I actually want? Not what do I think I should want, not what would impress other people, not what would make my parents proud, but what do I, in the deepest part of myself, actually want? This process of self-examination can be uncomfortable because it often reveals gaps between the life we're living and the life we actually want to live. It might reveal that we're spending our days in ways that don't align with our values, pursuing goals that don't actually excite us, trying to become someone we don't actually want to be. But this discomfort is valuable information. It's pointing us toward greater alignment, toward a life that requires less forced discipline because it's more naturally disciplined. There's another aspect of Thoreau's approach to discipline that's worth considering. He understood that discipline isn't just about doing, but also about not doing. Much of his discipline was about saying no to things that would pull him away from what mattered most to him. He said no to social conventions that felt empty to him. He said no to possessions that would complicate his life without adding real value. He said no to activities that would scatter his attention rather than focus it. This kind of discipline, the discipline of saying no, is perhaps even more important in our current age than it was in Thoreau's time. We're surrounded by more distractions, more opportunities, more demands on our attention than any generation in human history. The discipline we need most might not be the discipline to do more things, but the discipline to do fewer things, to choose more carefully, to protect our time and energy and attention like the precious resources they are. But again, this isn't about denying ourselves pleasure or opportunity. It's about being clear enough about what we truly want, that we can recognize what serves that deeper want and what doesn't. When we're clear about our priorities, saying no to things that don't align with those priorities doesn't feel like deprivation. It feels like protection, like caring for something valuable. Thoreau's famous night in jail for refusing to pay taxes that would support slavery and the Mexican-American War illustrates this beautifully. His refusal wasn't an act of willpower or self-discipline in the conventional sense. It was an act of alignment. His values were so clear to him that paying those taxes would have required him to act against his deepest convictions. The discipline he exercised was the discipline of staying true to himself even when it was inconvenient or costly. This raises an important question about the relationship between individual discipline and social responsibility. Thoreau didn't retreat to Walden Pond to escape from the world, but to see it more clearly, to live in a way that was aligned with his values, and to model a different way of being. His individual discipline was never separate from his social consciousness. His simple living was a form of social criticism, a way of demonstrating that it was possible to live well without participating in systems that he found morally objectionable. In our own time, we might ask similar questions. What does it mean to exercise discipline in a world that often seems to reward behavior that we know is ultimately destructive? How do we balance personal growth with social responsibility? How do we live deliberately in a culture that seems designed to keep us distracted and unconscious? These questions don't have easy answers, but they point toward a deeper understanding of what discipline might mean. Perhaps real discipline isn't about forcing ourselves to fit into systems that don't serve us or the world. Perhaps it's about having the courage to live according to our deeper values even when that's difficult or unpopular. Perhaps it's about the discipline to pay attention, to stay awake, to keep choosing consciousness over comfort. Thoreau wrote, "The only way to speak the truth is to speak lovingly." This might seem unrelated to questions of discipline and willpower, but I think there's a deep connection here. Much of our struggle with discipline comes from an adversarial relationship with ourselves. We try to force ourselves to change through criticism, through harsh self-talk, through punishment and reward systems that treat us like we're training an animal rather than nurturing a human being. But what if discipline could be an act of love rather than an act of war? What if the changes we want to make in our lives could come from a place of caring for ourselves rather than fighting with ourselves? This requires a different kind of attention, a gentler but no less committed approach to growth and change. When we discipline ourselves from a place of love, we pay attention to what our resistance is trying to tell us. Instead of just pushing through it, we get curious about it. Maybe our resistance to getting up early isn't laziness, but a signal that we're not getting enough rest. Maybe our difficulty sticking to an exercise routine isn't a lack of willpower, but a sign that we haven't found a form of movement that actually brings us joy. Maybe our struggle to eat well isn't a moral failing, but an indication that we're using food to meet needs that food can't actually meet. This kind of loving attention requires patience, which is itself a form of discipline. It requires the discipline to slow down, to listen, to approach our lives with curiosity rather than judgment. It requires us to trust that there's wisdom in our resistance, that our struggles might be pointing us toward greater understanding rather than just obstacles to overcome. Thoreau's approach to nature illustrates this beautifully. He didn't try to conquer or control the natural world. He tried to understand it, to learn from it, to align himself with its rhythms and patterns. He spent hours observing, listening, paying attention. His discipline was the discipline of a student rather than a master, someone who recognized that there was always more to learn, more to discover, more to understand. What if we approached our own nature, our habits, our desires, our patterns of behavior with the same kind of respectful attention? What if instead of trying to force ourselves to change, we spent time studying ourselves, understanding ourselves, learning what conditions support our growth and what conditions hinder it? This doesn't mean being passive or accepting everything about ourselves as unchangeable. Thoreau certainly wasn't passive. He made deliberate choices about how to live, what to pursue, what to let go of. But his changes came from understanding rather than force, from alignment rather than opposition. There's something profound here about the relationship between acceptance and change. Often we think these are opposites, that to change ourselves, we have to reject who we are now. But Thoreau's example suggests something different. He suggests that real change comes from deep acceptance of what is, combined with a clear vision of what could be. The discipline is in holding both of these at the same time, neither denying our current reality nor giving up on our deeper possibilities. This brings us to another important aspect of Thoreau's understanding of discipline. It's not about perfection. Thoreau never claimed to have figured everything out or to be living perfectly according to his ideals. His writings are full of observations about his own inconsistencies, his failures, his ongoing struggles to live up to his own vision. But this wasn't a source of self-criticism for him. It was a source of learning, of deeper understanding, of continued growth. In our perfection-obsessed culture, this is a radical idea. We often think that discipline means never failing, never falling short, never struggling. But Thoreau's example suggests that real discipline includes the discipline to fail gracefully, to learn from our mistakes, to begin again without judgment. The discipline to be human rather than trying to be some impossible ideal of human. This has profound implications for how we approach change in our own lives. Instead of seeing setbacks as evidence that we lack willpower or discipline, we might see them as information, as opportunities to understand ourselves better, as natural parts of the growth process. Instead of using our failures as reasons to give up or to criticize ourselves, we might use them as invitations to greater compassion, deeper understanding, more skillful approaches. Thoreau wrote, "I have never found a companion so companionable as solitude." This points to another crucial aspect of his understanding of discipline. It was deeply connected to his relationship with himself. Much of our struggle with discipline comes from a fundamental disconnection from ourselves, from not really knowing what we want or need or value. We try to impose discipline from the outside, using other people's systems and methods and goals, without taking the time to understand our own inner landscape. But real discipline, Thoreau suggests, emerges from intimacy with ourselves. It comes from spending time alone, paying attention to our own rhythms and patterns and desires. It comes from developing what we might call self-companionship, a friendly and curious relationship with our own experience. This solitude isn't about isolation or withdrawal from the world. Thoreau was deeply engaged with his community, with social issues, with the natural world around him. But his engagement came from a place of inner clarity and strength. He could be present to others because he was present to himself. He could contribute to the world because he understood his own gifts and limitations. In our hyper-connected age, This kind of solitude has become almost countercultural. We're constantly connected to others through our devices, constantly consuming information and entertainment, constantly stimulated by external input. But how can we exercise real discipline? The discipline of living deliberately, if we never spend time alone with ourselves, never create space to hear our own thoughts and feelings, never practice the art of self-companionship. This brings us to one of the most important questions we can ask about discipline. What is it in service of? Thoreau's discipline was always in service of something larger than just personal improvement or achievement. He wanted to live deliberately so that he could contribute something meaningful to the world. He wanted to simplify his life so that he could focus on what mattered most. He wanted to understand himself so that he could be of service to others. Much of our modern approach to discipline is focused on self-improvement as an end in itself. We want to be more productive, more successful, more accomplished. But Thoreau suggests that discipline is most powerful when it's connected to something beyond ourselves, when it's in service of values and purposes that matter to us deeply. This doesn't mean that personal growth isn't important. Thoreau was deeply committed to his own development and understanding, but his personal growth was always connected to larger questions. How can I live in a way that's aligned with my values? How can I contribute to a more just and beautiful world? How can I use my brief time on earth in a way that matters? When discipline is connected to these kinds of deeper questions, it takes on a different quality. It becomes less about self-control and more about self-expression. It becomes less about denying ourselves and more about becoming ourselves more fully. It becomes less about fitting into existing systems and more about creating new possibilities. Thoreau's famous declaration that if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer, speaks to this. Real discipline might sometimes require us to march to our own rhythm, to follow our own path, even when that path looks different from what others expect or approve of. This takes a different kind of courage than the courage to force ourselves to do things we don't want to do. It takes the courage to trust ourselves, to trust our own instincts and values and vision. But this kind of individual discipline is never separate from our connection to others and to the world. Thoreau's solitude at Walden was connected to his engagement with social issues. His simple living was connected to his concern for justice and sustainability. His personal practice was always in dialogue with larger questions about how we might live together more wisely and compassionately. This brings us to perhaps the most important insight about discipline that we can draw from Thoreau's example. It's not ultimately about control, it's about responsiveness. It's about developing the capacity to respond to life from our deepest values and clearest understanding, rather than just reacting from habit or social conditioning or unconscious patterns. This kind of responsiveness requires awareness, which is itself a practice. It requires us to pay attention to what's happening inside us and around us, to notice our patterns and impulses and choices, to stay conscious in situations where it would be easier to just go unconscious. This is perhaps the most fundamental discipline of all, the discipline of staying awake, of remaining present to our own experience and to the world around us. When we think about discipline this way, the question of whether self-discipline is good or bad becomes much more nuanced. Discipline that comes from awareness, that serves our deeper values, that helps us become more ourselves rather than less ourselves. This kind of discipline seems not just good, but essential. But discipline that comes from self-criticism, that serves goals that aren't really our own, that requires us to deny or fight against our fundamental nature, this kind of discipline might actually be harmful, a form of self-violence disguised as self-improvement. The key is learning to distinguish between these different kinds of discipline, learning to recognize when our efforts at self-control are serving our growth and when they might be serving someone else's idea of who we should be. This requires the kind of honest self-examination that Thoreau practiced, the willingness to question not just how we're living, but why we're living that way. Thoreau wrote, "Things do not change, we change." This points to another crucial insight about discipline. Real change happens at the level of perception and understanding, not just behavior. We can force ourselves to change our actions through willpower, but unless we change our understanding, unless we shift our perspective, those behavioral changes are likely to be temporary and effortful. But when we change at the level of understanding, when we truly see something differently, behavioral change often follows naturally. If we truly understand that a particular habit isn't serving us, we don't need to force ourselves to stop. The behavior changes because our understanding has changed. If we truly see that a certain way of living aligns with our deepest values, we don't need to discipline ourselves to live that way. We want to live that way. This suggests that the most powerful discipline might not be the discipline to change our behavior, but the discipline to examine our understanding, to question our assumptions, to stay open to new ways of seeing. This is the discipline of learning, of growth, of remaining curious about life, even when we think we have things figured out. Thoreau's 2 years at Walden Pond were an experiment in this kind of discipline. He wasn't trying to prove anything or achieve anything in the conventional sense. He was trying to understand something, to learn something, to see what life had to teach him when he paid attention carefully enough. His discipline was the discipline of an experimenter, someone willing to try new ways of living to see what might be possible. This experimental approach to discipline is worth considering in our own lives. Instead of committing rigidly to particular habits or goals, what if we approached our lives as ongoing experiments? What if we tried things with curiosity rather than attachment, willing to learn from whatever happens rather than needing to succeed according to some predetermined standard? This doesn't mean being wishy-washy or uncommitted. Thoreau was deeply committed to his experiment at Walden, but his commitment was to the process of learning and discovery rather than to any particular outcome. He was disciplined about showing up to the experiment, but flexible about what the experiment might teach him. As we near the end of this reflection, it's worth returning to the question we started with: is self-discipline good or bad? Thoreau's example suggests that this is the wrong question. The better question might be, what kind of discipline serves life, and what kind of discipline diminishes it? What kind of discipline helps us become more ourselves, and what kind requires us to become less ourselves? The discipline that Thoreau practiced and wrote about was life-serving discipline. It was discipline in service of clarity, of authenticity, of meaningful contribution to the world. It was discipline that emerged from love rather than fear, from understanding rather than force, from a deep desire to live fully rather than a fear of living wrongly. This kind of discipline is not only good, it's essential. In a world that often seems designed to keep us distracted, unconscious, and disconnected from what matters most, the discipline to pay attention, to live deliberately, to stay true to our deepest values is perhaps the most important skill we can develop. But this discipline looks different from the harsh self-control that our culture often promotes. It's gentler, but no less committed. It's more responsive and less rigid. It's more curious and less judgmental. It's more connected to love and less driven by fear. Perhaps most importantly, it's sustainable. The discipline that comes from alignment with our deeper nature doesn't exhaust us. It energizes us. It doesn't require us to fight against ourselves. It allows us to express ourselves more fully. It doesn't separate us from life. It connects us more deeply to what's alive in us and around us. Thoreau left Walden Pond after 2 years, not because his experiment had failed, but because it had succeeded. He had learned what he came to learn. He had discovered that it was possible to live deliberately, to align his daily life with his deepest values, to find richness and meaning in simplicity. But he also discovered that this wasn't a destination to arrive at once and for all. It was a way of being that required ongoing attention, ongoing choice, ongoing commitment to consciousness over comfort. The invitation that Thoreau extends to us across the centuries is not to copy his specific choices, but to engage in our own experiment in deliberate living, to discover what discipline means for us, what it looks like to align our lives with our deepest values, what it feels like to live from our own center rather than from other people's expectations. This is work that each of us must do for ourselves. No one else can tell us what our authentic life looks like or what kind of discipline will serve it. But Thoreau's example reminds us that this work is possible, that it's worthwhile, and that it's perhaps the most important work we can do with our brief time on this earth. The question isn't whether self-discipline is good or bad. The question is whether we have the courage to discover what kind of discipline serves our own unique path toward a life fully lived. That discovery, Thoreau suggests, is not just possible, but necessary. It's the work of becoming human in the fullest sense of the word, and it's work that the world desperately needs each of us to do.